I grew up in what most people would call a close-knit family. It was just the three of us, my mother, my sister, and me. We were always there for one another, always supporting each other through the highs and lows of life. My mother, despite her strict demeanor, had a softness in her eyes when it came to her children. My sister, younger by a few years, had an unyielding energy, a charisma that could brighten even the dullest of days. They were my constants, my anchors. Yet, as I grew older, I began to notice cracks in the foundation of our perfect family image. It was subtle at first, in fleeting glances and in the way they lingered in my presence just a little too long. At family gatherings, when laughter echoed through the room, I'd catch my sister's eyes on me, her smile a little too warm, her gaze holding a quiet intensity that made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't explain. My mother, too, began to act differently. Her touch lingered on my shoulder when she walked past. Her compliments felt more personal, as though she was searching for validation in my reactions. I chalked it up to overthinking. They were my family, after all. What could it mean beyond the love we naturally shared? But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave me. It was there when my sister curled up on the couch next to me, her head resting on my shoulder, the scent of her shampoo invading my senses. It was there when my mother sat across from me during dinner, her gaze steady, studying me in a way that felt more searching than maternal. One evening, we were all sitting together after dinner, a rare moment when none of us had any distractions. The conversation meandered from childhood memories to current worries. My sister mentioned how her relationship wasn't going well, how she felt unseen and unappreciated. My mother nodded in agreement, saying that she, too, had her fair share of regrets in love, though she didn't go into detail. They both looked at me expectantly, as though waiting for me to offer something, anything, that could fill the voids they were hinting at. There was an unspoken understanding in the air that night, a weight pressing down on me as I sat between them. They didn't say it outright, but their words, their gestures, carried an undertone that I couldn't ignore. My sister's hand brushed mine as she reached for her glass, and she didn't pull away. My mother's laughter lingered, rich and full, but it felt almost too intimate, as though it were meant for me alone. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. It wasn't just familiar love anymore. It was something deeper, something more complicated, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. The days following that evening were marked by a strange tension I couldn't escape. My sister became more open, more vulnerable around me. She started calling me late at night, her voice soft, almost breaking, as she shared intimate details about her struggles. She spoke of the loneliness that consumed her, how she felt disconnected from everyone, even herself. Her words clung to me, each confession pulling me deeper into a space I wasn't sure I should occupy. At first, I thought she just needed a shoulder to lean on, someone she trusted. But it was in the way she looked at me during those moments, as though I were her solace, her escape. It wasn't just about the words anymore. It was about the unspoken connection between us that seemed to grow stronger every time we talked. She began seeking me out more often, finding reasons to spend time with me, even if it was just to sit quietly in the same room. There was a warmth in her presence, but also a weight, as if she were waiting for me to acknowledge something I wasn't ready to see. My mother, on the other hand, had a different approach. She wasn't as direct, but her intentions felt just as clear. She began reminiscing about the past, sharing stories about when I was a child, emphasizing how much she had sacrificed for the family. Her tone wasn't bitter, but there was a longing in her voice that made it hard to ignore. She would touch my arm lightly during these conversations, her fingers lingering just long enough to make my chest tighten. One evening, as I sat in the living room, my mother joined me, carrying 2 cups of tea. She sat closer than usual, her voice softer, almost conspiratorial. She spoke about her regrets, how life hadn't turned out the way she'd imagined. There was an honesty in her words that felt almost too raw, too personal. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine, and said, "You've always been so different. So understanding." It was a simple statement, but the weight behind it made my pulse quicken. I found myself caught in the middle of their quiet desires, their subtle advances. My sister's vulnerability, her need for comfort, drew me in, while my mother's quiet strength and emotional depth held me in place. It wasn't as though they were competing openly, but the lines between us had started to blur in ways I couldn't ignore. The worst part was that I didn't push them away. I told myself I was just being supportive, that I was fulfilling my role in the family. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was a part of me that craved the attention, that felt flattered by their affection. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. I was walking a thin line, one that could shatter everything if I wasn't careful. But no matter how much I told myself to stop, I couldn't deny the pull they both had over me. It was a quiet evening when everything shifted, an ordinary moment that turned into something I couldn't undo. My sister had been unusually quiet that day, her usual energy replaced with a subdued demeanor. She asked me to talk, her voice softer than usual, her eyes pleading for understanding. I agreed, thinking it would be like every other conversation we'd had, her confiding, me listening, trying to offer the right words to ease her pain. But this time, it felt different. As she spoke, her emotions spilled out like a flood. She talked about feeling invisible in her own life, how no one truly saw her for who she was. Her voice cracked, and she reached for me, her hand trembling as it brushed against mine. For a moment, I hesitated. This wasn't just a plea for comfort. It was something deeper, something I didn't know how to navigate. But instead of pulling away, I let her linger. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just being there for her. Then there was my mother. She walked in on us, her face calm but her eyes betraying a flicker of something I couldn't place. Was it surprise? Curiosity? I expected her to say something, to break the moment, but she didn't. Instead, she joined us, her presence grounding and unsettling all at once. She asked if everything was okay, her tone gentle, almost too careful. My sister nodded, but I could feel the tension in the room, thick and heavy, wrapping around all of us. Later that night, my mother came to me alone. She sat beside me, her voice low, almost hesitant, as she told me she understood what I was going through. "It's hard to always be the strong one," she said, her hand brushing against my arm. There was something in her touch, something that made my heart race. It wasn't motherly. It was something else entirely. In that moment, the boundaries I had clung to began to dissolve. I didn't resist when she stayed close, when her words turned softer, her gaze more intense. It was like a dam had broken, and I couldn't stop the flood of emotions that followed. My sister had left me vulnerable, and my mother had stepped into that space, her presence both comforting and overwhelming. The night unfolded in a haze of emotions I didn't fully understand. There were no clear lines anymore, no way to separate what was right from what was wrong. I felt myself pulled in two directions, each one equally impossible to resist. They both seemed to want something from me that I couldn't define, something I wasn't sure I could give. And yet I gave in, letting the moment carry me away, knowing even then that it would change everything. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a betrayal of the roles we were supposed to play in each other's lives. But in those moments, none of that seemed to matter. All I felt was the weight of their desires and my inability to say no. The days that followed felt surreal, as though I were living in a fragile, altered reality. I couldn't look at either of them without feeling the weight of what had happened, the choices we had made. My sister was quieter than usual, her usual vibrant energy replaced by careful, deliberate calm. When she spoke to me, it was with a softness that hinted at unspoken words she wasn't ready to voice. She stayed close but never too close, as though she were testing the boundaries, unsure of where we stood now. My mother, on the other hand, seemed almost unchanged on the surface. She carried on with the same composure and grace, as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. But there were moments when her gaze lingered just a second too long, or her voice softened in ways that made my stomach twist with unease. She didn't speak about what had happened, but her silence wasn't an escape. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a subtle reminder of the line we had crossed together. I found myself caught in the middle, torn between the weight of guilt and the pull of an unspoken connection that refused to let go. Family dinners became a minefield of unspoken tension. My sister would avoid meeting my eyes, but I could feel her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking. My mother, always poised, would ask seemingly innocent questions that felt layered with hidden meanings. The air was thick with things unsaid, and every moment spent together only deepened the sense that we were all playing a game we didn't know how to end. I tried to move on, to push the memories to the back of my mind, but they clung to me, an ever-present reminder of my failure to uphold the trust and boundaries that once defined us. I thought about confronting them, about finding a way to untangle the mess we had created, but I didn't know where to start. What could I possibly say? That I was sorry? That I regretted it? The truth was, I wasn't sure if I regretted it, and that realization scared me more than anything else. The guilt didn't just come from what we had done. It came from the fact that a part of me didn't want to let it go. There was a closeness now, an intimacy that hadn't existed before, and while it was wrong, it was also undeniable. They had both opened up to me in ways I had never experienced, and a part of me craved that connection, even as it threatened to tear us apart. In the end, I realized there was no easy resolution, no way to undo what had been done. All I could do was live with it, with the weight of our choices and the consequences they brought. The silence between us spoke louder than words, a constant reminder that some lines, once crossed, could never be redrawn. And yet, despite the pain, despite the guilt, I couldn't help but feel that a part of me would never let go of what we had shared, no matter how much it cost us.